So I did not like this book that much. It just was not as good as his second book, which is Textual Analysis on Majora's Mask. My major problems with this book is a lot of the evidence that he presents and the arguments that he makes don't really fit too well with the game or with really any of the examples that he's trying to raise. It's almost like he's got like a bunch of puzzles that he's trying to put together, but none of the pictures are the same, and he's just sort of forcing a lot of these pieces into place that don't work out very well for me. His second book, Majora's Mask, that one is laid out much better than this one, where you go through the different dungeons and you go through the main characters, and it's all laid out with a pretty centralized argument that runs throughout the book. This one, there isn't that, and Jared tries to fit in a lot of things, like I said, that just don't really need to be there, don't make a lot of sense, or in most examples, he's not really even focusing on the game or anything else like that. He's focusing on the points that these outside examples are making, but it doesn't feel like it's tied back into the book at all. Also, a lot of what he says, it's very subjective, and I don't think you can make like a blanket statement for some of the points that he attempts to make, and we'll get more into that later. So one of the biggest problems I have with this book, and there are a lot of problems I have with this, but it seems like something is introduced in the chapter and then it's like immediately abandoned in favor of a lot of his examples, which, I'm sorry to repeat myself, they didn't work too well for me. And it's a very weird book, and I know that this was at least the first one that he tried to do, and it came out and everything, and it's fine, but it doesn't work out as well as the second book. And he brings up a lot of stuff that I just don't think works very well. Or in one case, the dungeons and the puzzles are separated out into different chapters when in all honesty they should have been combined. This is just me reading it. He should have broken down the dungeons individually instead of lumping them all into one large chapter. And I think you could have had a better conversation about the puzzles if they were in the specific dungeons. If you mentioned this dungeon has this puzzle, this is kind of the theme of this dungeon. And even if you can't see what that is, you can kind of point out how, okay, well maybe this one would have worked better if it was somewhere else, or maybe if they had changed this puzzle in this way, it would have worked out better. He goes through this long example of all the different types of puzzles and all the different things that you could do to challenge yourself, and I don't understand why he does it. It just seems like a bunch of garbage that's thrown in to like pad out the length of the book. And I'm really, really sorry to say that, but that's just how it feels when you're reading this. You're like, okay, great. Can you get to your goddamn point and talk about the game and everything else? Like, that would make more sense to me. He does the same thing with the art style of the book. Now, this was a different one because this moved into like the cell shading and everything like that was becoming really popular in the early 2000s. And he just messes it up, to be perfectly honest. It was a huge missed opportunity to talk about. Because he brings up a bunch of stupid things. Like, he talks about expressionism, which, okay, but you're not really focusing on all of expressionism. You're only talking about the parts that fit with what you're saying. It's almost like you're kind of cherry picking your evidence a little bit, which is fine to do in some cases, but when, at least for me as the reader, most of the expressionism I know comes from like German horror films from the 1920s and 1930s, and that's my experience with expressionism. It's not just painting. Like, there's other mediums that you find expressionism in, and that's just kind of glossed over by Jared, which I think was not really the right way to do it. He could have talked about it in a different way. He could have brought up other games that use cell shading. He could have talked more about the fan outrage over it. He could have mentioned a lot of other things, but he focuses in on expressionism, and I'm like, this has nothing to do with the game. It has nothing to do with a lot of what you're talking about. And it just feels like really out of place, and you take up most of the chapter talking about it, and I don't understand why you did this. He also goes into level design, which it kind of goes back to what I was talking about with the puzzles and the dungeons, but this part really, really kind of irked me when he goes into level design. This is incredibly subjective to talk about, and to apply some kind of a formula to it makes no sense to me. Because you can have multiple people playing the same dungeon, and you can have people go, oh, well, this isn't laid out right, or this isn't laid out right, or this isn't done well, this wasn't fun for me, but it was fun for someone else. It's just a very subjective thing to look at. And it kind of goes to why there are so many different games out there. There are very few games that are like universally seen as this is bad level design, this is an awful game, this isn't good. There's very few games like that out there. You'll really struggle to find probably like 1,000 games like that. And trust me, there are more than 1,000 games out there. But when he talks about it, it's just like, okay, you're applying this mathematical formula, you bring up a bunch of charts and graphs and everything, but you're not the arbiter of what good level design is. You're not the one that's like, okay, this fits into this mathematical formula, therefore it's good. That's not the way fun works. And this goes back to a few other books that I've talked about. How do you design fun into a game? And there's no right or wrong way to do it. You have to have people sit down and play this game and figure out whether they enjoy it or not. It's not this weird formula that you're going to say, okay, this is now a fun level because it fits X, Y, and Z according to this specific formula that we have. So all of that being said, all of the problems that I have with this book, I will say this is a good book. It's not as awful as I have laid it out to be or that I've said. It's just, if you look at it in this way, it's an attempt to write down an analysis of an actual video game, which is a good goal and it makes a lot of sense to do. I just wish he had done that instead of bringing in examples that don't work out too well. There are other books out there that have done similar things, and I applaud those books for doing it. 8-Bit Apocalypse is one of those where they talk about Missile Command. It's an entire book about Missile Command, which is not a super complicated game to begin with. And that was done much better than this. So if Jared had done, I'll lay out a few things. If Jared had done interviews with some of the people that made Wind Waker, and I understand that would have been very hard for him. There's language barriers, there's time barriers, there's location barriers. They also might not know who he is, so they might just said, no, we're not going to talk to you. But if he had at least looked for other things that had been said by a lot of the different developers, not just Shigeru Miyamoto, but other people that have worked on the game, or if he had gone more into like some of the fan theories and everything and seen what the other people have said about the game and bring those into the book, that would have made this a little bit, I would have weighted it more, and that would have been a much better version of this book than what it is. I know he he corrected a lot of these mistakes in his Majora's Mask analysis, which I'm very glad for. That was a fun book to read, and I'm glad that he took, at least he took a look at what he did in the first book and said, I can improve on it, and did. And I hope that he improves on Majora's Masks as well, and continues to do these, because I think they're pretty important in video game history and also in video game literature, which is apparently a much larger topic than I thought it was when I started this series. Anyway, guys, I did not enjoy this book. I don't really recommend it. I think if you want to read an analysis of a game like this, again, either read 8-Bit Apocalypse or read Jared's book on Majora's Mask, which is just a textual analysis on Majora's Mask. It's a much better book. So guys, the next book we're going to read is Faster Than Light, the Atari ST and the 16-Bit Revolution by Jamie Landino. This is his third book, and I'm really looking forward to reading this one. I liked most of his first two books. He tends to throw a lot of software reviews in there, which can be okay, but they just kind of feel at some point that he's just throwing them in there to throw them in there. Anyway, guys, I hope you all enjoyed this one, and I will talk to you all later. Have a great day.